I trace the edge of the 10-carat diamond on my ring finger, feeling its impossibly sharp facets bite into my skin. It's supposed to be a symbol of eternal devotion, a glittering, unshakable promise from a man who laid his sprawling corporate empire at my feet. But standing here in the grand ballroom of the Carrington estate, surrounded by shimmering crystal chandeliers, the intoxicating scent of imported white roses, and the elite of the city, all I feel is the suffocating weight of a velvet trap. I am Brooke Brooke Carrington now. The absolute envy of every high society woman in the room. The girl who beat the odds, secured the ultimate bag, and became the dutiful young wife of Richard Carrington, the billionaire who pulled me from the wreckage of my shattered life. But if these walls, covered in centuries-old silk tapestries, could talk, they wouldn't whisper about a fairy tale romance. They would scream about the rot beneath the pristine floorboards. They would tell you exactly how my gaze inevitably, traitorously drifts past my husband's loving, aging face, past the clinking champagne flutes, and mocks onto him, Bradley. He is standing in the shadows by the terrace doors, his dark, devastating eyes burning into mine with a volatile mixture of raw, desperate hunger and agonizing guilt. I am living the ultimate lie, teetering blindly on the edge of a jagged precipice. And the terrifying, unspoken truth is I am entirely ready to jump. How did I end up playing this dangerous game of Russian roulette with my own soul? To understand the monster I've become, you have to understand the bruised, broken girl I was just a year ago. Before the Carrington millions padded my existence, before the whispered scandals and the stolen glances, there was just my father. He was my absolute anchor, the only source of genuine warmth in a house kept freezing cold by my mother's insatiable vanity. When his heart suddenly gave out on a dreary, rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon, my own heart died right along with him. The grief wasn't just sadness. It was a physical agony, a hollow, echoing void in my chest that made it excruciatingly hard to draw a breath. I was barely 23, standing lost in a sea of black umbrellas at his funeral, when a horrifying realization struck me. My mother, Victoria, wasn't weeping over the loss of her husband. She was silently, frantically calculating the loss of her lifestyle. Within weeks of his burial, the ugly truth came crashing down on us. My father had left us drowning in a tidal wave of hidden debt. Victoria had bled him completely dry with her reckless spending, her obsession with country clubs, designer labels, and maintaining a flawless illusion of high society grandeur. I blamed her. God, I blamed her with every single fiber of my being. Her relentless stress, her constant, nagging demands, her cold indifference, she had practically pushed him into an early grave. And instead of mourning the man who gave her everything, she immediately wiped away her crocodile tears and began hunting for a new benefactor. Her ultimate target? Richard Carrington, the recently widowed patriarch of Carrington Holdings. Richard was everything Victoria desperately needed, unimaginably wealthy, universally respected, and cripplingly lonely after the loss of his wife. I was forced to tag along to endless charity galas, silent auctions, and equestrian events, acting as a quiet, invisible prop while Victoria shamelessly threw herself at him. She wore dresses cut just a fraction too low, laughed far too loudly at his polite, aristocratic jokes, and painted herself as the tragic, sophisticated widow in need of rescuing. It made me physically sick. I watched her parade her manufactured grief, using the sacred memory of my beloved father as a cheap, transactional sympathy card. I wanted to destroy her. I wanted her to feel just a fraction of the utter powerlessness I felt watching my father slip away. And then the universe handed me the perfect glittering weapon. Richard didn't want Victoria. His eyes, kind, wise, but carrying a heavy weariness, kept bypassing my mother's desperate, theatrical performance and landing squarely on me. He saw through the noise. He saw my genuine, quiet sorrow, mistaking my brooding, angry silence for the grace of an old soul. We started talking, actually talking. Beneath the billionaire facade, he was just a man missing his anchor. He spoke of his late wife, his creeping fears of growing old alone in his vast, echoing mansion. I listened. It was innocent at first, a mutual sharing of grief, until I caught the barely concealed, lethal fury in my mother's eyes when Richard invited me for a walk in the botanical gardens, leaving her fuming by the hors d'oeuvres table. The day Richard Carrington asked me to marry him, we were sitting in his private, climate-controlled greenhouse surrounded by thousands of rare, blooming orchids. He was 30 years my senior, a gentle, honorable man offering me the entire world on a silver platter. He promised to take care of me, to effortlessly wipe away the mountain of debt my father left behind, to make me safe. But when I looked into his eyes and said yes, my heart didn't flutter with breathless romance. It surged with a dark, venomous, intoxicating triumph. When I broke the news to Victoria, casually sliding the heavy, velvet box containing the ring across the kitchen island, the look on her face was pure, unadulterated devastation. Her jaw trembled violently, her meticulously applied mask of arrogant superiority shattering into a million jagged pieces right before my eyes. It was the best high I had ever felt. I had stolen her golden prize. I had secured my own untouchable future and executed my revenge in one ruthless, beautiful stroke. The wedding was a whirlwind blur of flashing paparazzi cameras, blinding diamonds, and forced, practiced smiles. Moving into the Carrington estate felt like stepping through a portal into a different century. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the wealth was paralyzing. I brought Victoria with me, of course. Moving her into the guest wing was my ultimate power move. Keeping my defeated enemy agonizingly close, entirely dependent on my newfound magnanimous grace, I paid off the debts. I was the lady of the manor. I threw myself violently into the role of the perfect wife, desperate to convince myself that this victory was enough. I met his children, Natalie, sharp, wildly observant, but surprisingly welcoming, thrilled that someone was bringing life back to the house. And Ben, a younger soul who was just genuinely happy to see his father smile again. Then there was Diana, the stern, fiercely loyal, graying governess who had practically raised the children. I could see the hidden, bitter resentment tightening her thin lips every single time she looked at me, a woman clearly harboring her own desperate, secret love for the master of the house, forced to stand by and watch a young, interloping upstart take the place she felt she had earned through decades of silent devotion. I thought I had the chessboard perfectly arranged. I thought I had unequivocally won the game of life. I had unlimited money, unbreakable security, the permanent upper hand over my cruel mother, and a husband who treated me like a fragile, precious porcelain doll. It was a perfectly safe, beautifully sterile life. Until he walked through the heavy oak doors of the estate, carrying a worn leather duffel bag, the fresh scent of rain, and a crooked smile that made my perfectly constructed, diamond-encrusted world instantly begin to crumble. His name was Bradley. He was Richard's nephew, the 25-year-old orphan son of Richard's late brother. Richard had taken him in over a decade ago, raising him with the same quiet, heavy-handed generosity he bestowed upon everyone. I knew he existed, of course, but the abstract concept of a nephew studying architecture in Europe hadn't prepared me for the devastating reality of the man standing in the grand foyer, dripping rainwater onto the priceless Persian rug. He didn't look like he belonged in this sterile museum of a house. Where Richard was immaculate tailoring and perfectly controlled composure, Bradley was a study in chaotic vitality. He had dark, disheveled hair, broad shoulders, and eyes the color of dark roasted coffee eyes that locked onto me with an unnerving, piercing intensity the second I descended the curved marble staircase. He didn't look at me with the polite, deferential awe the rest of the staff and family did. He looked at me like he was mentally dismantling my perfectly tailored Chanel suit, trying to find the pulse of the real girl hiding underneath. "You must be the miracle," he said, his voice a low, gravelly timbre that sent an involuntary, terrifying shiver straight down my spine. A smirk played on his lips as he dropped his duffel bag. Uncle Richard's new bride. The one who brought him back to life. "Brooke," I managed to say, my voice sounding embarrassingly breathless in the cavernous hall. I extended a hand, the 10-carat diamond feeling suddenly like a lead weight. He took my hand, but he didn't shake it politely. His fingers wrapped around mine, warm and calloused, his thumb brushing just for a fraction of a second against my pulse point. It was an electric shock. A violent physical jolt that made my breath hitch. "Bradley," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the obnoxious diamond before meeting my eyes again. "Congratulations, Brooke. You've really hit the jackpot." The mockery in his tone was subtle, but it burned. He knew. In that single, fleeting interaction, I realized with a sinking dread that Bradley Carrington saw right through me. He didn't see the tragic, devoted young wife. He saw the desperate, calculating girl who had sold her youth for a fortress of gold. In the weeks that followed, my gilded cage began to shrink. I tried to play my part. I hosted charity luncheons, I organized Richard's medications, I smiled adoringly at dinner parties while my husband recounted the same 3 stories about his golf handicap. Richard was so incredibly good to me. He treated me with a gentle reverence, like a rare painting he had acquired and wished to preserve. But there was no fire. His kisses were soft paternal pecks on the cheek. His embraces were comforting but utterly devoid of passion. I was 23 years old, brimming with a life I was forced to suppress beneath layers of cashmere and propriety. And then there was Bradley. He was everywhere. I would find him sketching in the conservatory, the sleeves of his Henley pushed up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. We would cross paths in the sprawling, dimly lit library at 2 a.m., both of us plagued by insomnia in a house that felt too big to sleep in. Every interaction was a dangerous, intoxicating sparring match. We fought over literature, over the pretentious modern art Richard bought, over anything and everything just to have an excuse to speak to one another. "You play the dutiful wife beautifully," he whispered one evening as we stood on the terrace, the sounds of a string quartet drifting from the ballroom where Richard was entertaining clients. The night air was thick and humid, smelling of ozone and impending rain. Bradley stepped closer, invading my personal space until I could smell the sharp, clean scent of cedar and soap on his skin. "But your eyes look like they're screaming for a way out. You don't know anything about me," I snapped, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tried to step back, but my spine hit the cold stone balustrade. "I know you're suffocating," he countered softly, leaning in until his lips were inches from my ear. "I know that when he touches you, you go completely rigid. And I know that when I walked into the room tonight, you stopped breathing for exactly 3 seconds. Panic, hot and blinding, surged through me. Because he was right. God help me, he was absolutely right. The smug satisfaction of defeating my mother, the comfort of the endless bank accounts, it was all turning to ash in my mouth. I was falling for him. I was falling into a terrifying, consuming, gravitational pull toward the one man on earth I was absolutely forbidden to have. The guilt was agonizing. Richard had saved me. Richard was the father Bradley never had. We were both betraying the best man we knew just by existing in the same room. The psychological torture was unbearable. Every morning I would sit across from Victoria at breakfast in the sunroom. My mother, practically purring with the luxury I had provided her, would sip her mimosa and compliment my brilliant, strategic mind. But her eyes, sharp and predatory as a hawk's, missed nothing. She noticed when I flinched at Richard's touch. And worse, she noticed the way the oxygen seemed to instantly vaporize from the room whenever Bradley entered. The true horror of my situation crystallized on a stormy Thursday afternoon. I had retreated to the dusty, forgotten archives room in the East Wing to escape my mother's endless chatter about country club memberships. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. I didn't turn around, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew it was him. A crack of thunder rattled the stained glass windows, and suddenly the massive house plunged into absolute darkness. The power was out. "Brooke." Bradley's voice came from the pitch black, thick with a raw, desperate edge I had never heard before. I couldn't see him, but I felt his hand slide around my waist in the dark. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was possessive, urgent, and completely reckless. My entire body ignited. Every suppressed desire, every ounce of fake composure I had maintained for months, shattered in a single instant. I didn't push him away. Instead, a sob tore from my throat, and my hands found the lapels of his jacket, pulling him desperately closer. As his mouth crashed down on mine, hungry and bruising and tasting of rain, the overwhelming, terrifying reality of what I had done crashed over me. I wasn't the master manipulator who had won the game. I was a foolish, arrogant girl who had locked herself in a beautiful, impenetrable vault, only to realize I had left my own heart on the outside and the man holding the key was the one man who could destroy us all. And standing just outside the heavy, slightly ajar oak door of the archive room, half hidden in the shadows of the corridor, stood Diana, the governess. Her face was illuminated by a brief, jagged flash of lightning, twisting her severe features into a mask of pure, vindictive triumph. That single, lightning-lit kiss in the dusty archive room didn't just cross a line. It obliterated the entire foundation of the life I had built. From that moment on, we became ghosts haunting my husband's sprawling estate. The sheer, suffocating size of the mansion, which had once felt like a prison, suddenly became our playground of shadows. Every time Richard looked at me with those kind, trusting eyes, every time he gently kissed my forehead and called me his savior, I felt like a monster. And Bradley was suffering just as much. I watched the light drain from his dark eyes day by day, replaced by a hollow, tortured exhaustion. We were two terrible people systematically destroying the one man who had loved us both unconditionally. I couldn't survive the double life anymore. I was losing my mind. Late one Tuesday night, while Richard was away in Chicago for a board meeting, I made the decision. I walked into my palatial bedroom, took the 10-carat diamond off my shaking finger, and placed it perfectly center on the vanity. I packed a single, unassuming duffel bag, no designer clothes, no jewelry, just the bare essentials of the girl I used to be. I found Bradley in the conservatory and gave him the ultimatum. Tonight, we leave tonight. I don't care about the money, the security, or the scandal. I only want you. We agreed to meet at the rusted, wrought iron service gates at the edge of the property at midnight. I waited in the freezing, relentless drizzle, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm of pure, unadulterated hope against my ribs. I was finally choosing love over fear. I was breaking the cycle. Then the heavy crunch of gravel signaled his approach. I ran toward the headlights of his Jeep, a watery smile breaking across my face until he stepped out into the rain. He was empty-handed. His shoulders were slumped and his face was a mask of pure, absolute devastation. "I can't do it, Brooke," he choked out, the words slicing through the frigid air like a serrated blade. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. I packed my bags. I had my hand on the doorknob, but he's my father, Brooke. Not by blood, but in every way that matters. He took me in when I was a terrified kid with nothing. If I run away with his wife, it won't just break his heart. It will kill him. I can't put a knife in the back of the best man I know. You're putting a knife in mine. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, raw and ugly, mingling with the rain. I beat my fists against his chest, begging him, pleading with him to be selfish just this once. But he just stood there, taking my blows, tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks, utterly immovable. He drove away, leaving me collapsed in the mud. I had never felt so violently cheap, so entirely abandoned. I dragged myself back to the mansion, a drowned rat crawling back into its gilded cage. I sneaked into my bedroom, my fingers numb and trembling as I picked up the heavy diamond ring and slid it back onto my finger. The shackle snapped shut. For 2 agonizing weeks, we were strangers. We avoided each other with a desperate, clinical precision. I thought the pain of his rejection would cure me, but it only made the obsession fester. The magnetic pull was simply too violent to resist. It happened in the library. A momentary lapse in judgment, an accidental brush of hands reaching for the same book, and the ice shattered. We were back in the fire, tearing at each other with a renewed, destructive ferocity, entirely unable to stop the runaway train we had boarded. But we had grossly underestimated the predators living in the house. Victoria, my mother, is a woman who can smell a threat to her bank account from a mile away. She had noticed the tension, the lingering glances, the way I flinched when Richard returned from his trip. She knew I was playing with a match in a room full of dynamite, and if my marriage blew up, she would be thrown right back into the poverty she so deeply despised. Instead of confronting me, she deployed a strategy so sick, so flawlessly evil, it makes my blood run cold to this day. If Bradley was a threat, she needed to neutralize him. She needed him married off and out of my orbit. First, she orchestrated a heavy-handed setup with Emily, a vapid, high-society heiress. Bradley saw right through it and sabotaged the relationship within days. But Victoria never gives up. She simply changed targets. She aimed for the most sheltered, vulnerable person in the entire Carrington family, Natalie. Richard's 20-year-old daughter was sweet, naive, and had always looked at Bradley with a quiet, hero-worshipping admiration. Victoria slithered into Natalie's life like a velvet snake. I watched, paralyzed with horror, as my mother began spending hours with my stepdaughter. She whispered poisonous, calculated suggestions into the girl's ear. She twisted Bradley's protective, brotherly affection, convincing Natalie that his lingering looks and deep sighs were signs of a suppressed, passionate, romantic love. "He's just waiting for you to realize it, darling," my mother would coo over afternoon tea. "He needs a woman of his own status, his own family." The absolute horror of the situation paralyzed me. My mother was deliberately pushing the man I loved into the arms of my husband's daughter, all to protect her luxurious lifestyle. The point of no return hit me with the force of a freight train. I walked into the sunlit parlor one afternoon and froze. Natalie was sitting on the chaise lounge, her cheeks flushed a vibrant pink, excitedly flipping through a glossy catalog of bridal gowns. Victoria stood behind her, gently brushing the girl's hair, looking over Natalie's shoulder. My mother's eyes locked onto mine. She didn't look away. Instead, a slow, terrifying, triumphant smirk spread across her lips. She had won. She had trapped him. I stumbled backward out of the parlor, the air completely knocked out of my lungs, my vision blurring with panic. I spun around to flee down the hallway, only to crash hard into a rigid shoulder. It was Diana. The governess didn't step back. She grabbed my forearm, her grip like a steel vise, her nails biting into my skin through my silk blouse. She leaned in so close I could smell the bitter peppermint on her breath. "It would be an absolute tragedy, Mrs. Carrington," Diana whispered, her voice dripping with lethal, barely contained venom. "If Mr. Carrington had to pay for a lavish wedding for his daughter only to discover that the groom has been warming his wife's bed every time he leaves town." The blood drained from my face so fast I thought I was going to faint right there in the Persian carpeted hallway. Diana's grip on my arm was bruising, her eyes alight with a decades-old, festering jealousy that had finally found its lethal weapon. I tried to pull away, but she held fast, her thin lips curved into a cruel, satisfied smile. "What do you want?" I choked out, the words scraping against my dry throat like sandpaper. "Money? Name your price, Diana." She let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "I don't want his money, you foolish, greedy little girl. I want my home back. I want the parasite expelled." She stepped back, smoothing the front of her starched uniform with terrifying calm. "Tonight is the family dinner. Richard plans to officially bless the union between Bradley and Natalie. You are going to pack your bags, walk into his study before dinner, and tell him you are leaving because you've realized you're not meant for this life. If you don't, I will stand before the entire table and tell them exactly what you and his beloved nephew have been doing in the dark." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me entirely paralyzed in the quiet, suffocating hallway. The hours leading up to the dinner were a waking nightmare. I was trapped in a psychological torture chamber, every tick of the grandfather clock sounding like the heavy drop of a guillotine blade. If I ran, I would be thrown back into the gutters of my past, leaving Bradley to be manipulated into a loveless marriage with Natalie by my sociopathic mother. But if I stayed, Dinah would detonate the bomb, destroying Richard's heart and publicly annihilating all of us in one catastrophic explosion. When I finally descended the stairs, dressed in a sweeping black silk gown that felt disturbingly like morning attire, the grand dining room was already buzzing. The air was thick with the scent of roasted pheasant, heavy red wine, and Victoria's expensive, cloying perfume. My mother was holding court at the end of the mahogany table, her eyes glittering with predatory triumph. She'd already won in her mind. Next to her sat Natalie, looking flushed and devastatingly beautiful, a radiant picture of innocent, young love. And then there was Bradley. He sat across from me, his face an unreadable mask of carved granite. He looked dead behind the eyes. He had resigned himself to being the ultimate martyr, ready to sacrifice his own life, his own happiness, and my heart, all to protect the illusion of Richard's perfect family. Richard sat at the head of the table, his kind face glowing with genuine, absolute joy. He reached out, his warm, weathered hand covering my freezing, trembling fingers. "You look pale, my darling," he murmured affectionately. "Are you all right?" I couldn't breathe. I looked past his shoulder and saw Dinah standing by the heavy velvet drapes, her posture rigid, her eyes locked on me with a silent, deadly countdown. Tick, tick, tick. "I'm fine," I whispered, pulling my hand away as if his touch burned. The dinner commenced, but the food tasted like ash in my mouth. I watched the horrifying pantomime play out before me. Victoria kept dropping not-so-subtle hints about spring weddings and joining the two branches of the Carrington legacy. Natalie blushed furiously, stealing shy, adoring glances at Bradley. And Bradley just kept drinking his scotch, staring a hole through the crystal glass, refusing to meet my agonizing gaze. He was actually going to let this happen. He was going to let my mother bury us alive. Then the moment of absolute terror arrived. Richard tapped his silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, melodic clink cut through the chatter like a gunshot. The room fell into an expectant, heavy silence. Dinah stepped half a pace forward from the shadows, her chin raising. "Family," Richard began, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he looked around the table. "When I lost my first wife, I thought this house would be a tomb forever. But life has a beautiful way of surprising us." He smiled lovingly at me, a smile that made my stomach violently heave with guilt. Brooke brought the light back. And now, seeing the profound bond forming between my brilliant daughter and the nephew I love as my own son. He raised his glass toward Bradley and Natalie. Victoria practically vibrated with ecstasy. Natalie covered her mouth, tears of joy springing to her eyes. Bradley finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting mine across the table. It was a silent, desperate plea. Let it happen, Brooke. Let me take the fall. But as I looked at the man I loved, a sudden blinding clarity pierced through my panic. I had spent my entire life being a pawn. I had let my father's debt control me. I had let my mother's greed sell me. I had let my fear build this gilded cage. If I stayed silent now, I wasn't just a victim. I was the villain. I would be condemning an innocent girl to a sham marriage and destroying the only real love I had ever known. I couldn't let Diana drop the guillotine. If my life was going to burn to the ground tonight, I was going to be the one to strike the match. Stop! The word ripped from my throat, a raw, guttural scream that shattered the elegant atmosphere into a million jagged pieces. The entire table froze. Richard's glass halted midair. Victoria's triumphant smile warped into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Diana's eyes widened in the shadows, her ultimate weapon suddenly ripped from her hands. I stood up, my chair violently scraping against the hardwood floor. My whole body was shaking, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't acting. The facade was dead. Brooke? Richard asked, his voice trembling with confusion. Darling, what is it? He can't marry her, Richard, I gasped. The tears I had been fighting for months finally spilling over, hot and blinding. I pointed a shaking finger at Bradley, who had gone completely pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. What on earth are you doing, you hysterical child? Victoria hissed, half rising from her seat, her eyes flashing with a desperate, murderous panic as she saw her millions slipping away. Sit down. I won't sit down. I screamed back at my mother, the decades of suppressed rage finally erupting. Then I turned my tear-streaked face to my husband, the kind, gentle man I was about to utterly destroy. He can't marry Natalie, Richard. Because he doesn't love her. The silence in the room was absolute, deafening, heavy as lead. Brooke, please, Bradley whispered, a broken, agonizing sound that tore my heart completely in two. He stood up, knocking his chair backward with a loud crash. Don't do this. I'm begging you. I have to, I sobbed, looking directly into Richard's bewildered, horrified eyes. The dust was suspended in the air. The fuse had reached the powder keg. He doesn't love her, Richard. Because he's in love with me, and God forgive me. I love him too. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a physical weight, a suffocating vacuum that sucked the oxygen straight out of the grand dining room. I watched, paralyzed by my own confession, as the color completely drained from Natalie's beautiful, youthful face. She let out a sound-a-high broken whimper of pure agony like a child who had just watched her favorite pet get run over. She didn't say a word. She just pushed herself away from the table, her chair tipping over with a violent crash, and sprinted out of the room, her sobs echoing down the cavernous marble hallway. Then the explosion came. But it wasn't Richard who detonated. It was Victoria. My mother lunged across the mahogany table, her manicured hands clawing the air, knocking over crystal wine glasses that shattered onto the priceless rugs, blooming like dark pools of blood. You stupid, selfish, ungrateful little bitch. She shrieked, her voice completely stripped of its cultivated high society purr, revealing the feral, desperate street cat underneath. I built this for you. I built this for us. You're throwing away a dynasty for a penniless orphan. She turned wildly to Richard, grabbing his sleeve. Richard, please, she's unwell. She doesn't know what she's saying. Enough, Victoria. Richard's voice wasn't a roar. It was a terrifying, hollow whisper. But it commanded the room with the absolute authority of a man who owned everything in it. He gently but firmly peeled my mother's claw-like fingers off his expensive suit. Then he slowly stood up. He looked at me, and in that single moment he seemed to age 20 years. The gentle, paternal glow in his eyes was dead, replaced by a bottomless great grief that made my knees buckle. Did you really think, Richard began, his voice trembling with a quiet devastation that cut deeper than any screaming match ever could, that you were the only ones playing a game in this house? I froze, the tears drying cold on my cheeks. Bradley, who had been standing rigidly by his chair, suddenly looked up, his jaw slackening. Richard looked past me, his gaze landing on the shadows by the curtains. "You can step out now, Diana." The governess stepped into the light, her triumphant smirk completely wiped away, replaced by a nervous, twitching swallow. "I have cameras in the archives, Brooke. I have them in the hallways." "I am a man who protects his investments," Richard said, the words falling from his lips like heavy stones. "I knew about the stolen kisses. I knew about the late-night meetings. I watched the two people I loved most in this world tear my heart to shreds behind my back." He let out a ragged, bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. "But I was a coward. I was an old, terrified man who didn't want to die alone. So when your mother came to me with her vile, manipulative plan to push Bradley toward Natalie, I didn't stop her. I funded it. I encouraged it. I thought if I could just trap Bradley in a marriage to my daughter, he would be bound by honor, and you would eventually surrender to the life I bought for you." The room started to spin. The twist was a physical blow to the stomach. The kind, honorable patriarch we had been so terrified of breaking had been pulling the strings all along, perfectly willing to sacrifice his own daughter's true happiness on the altar of his own desperate loneliness and my mother's greed. We were all monsters, trapped in a beautiful, poisonous terrarium of our own making. "But you broke the script, Brooke," Richard whispered, a single tear tracking down his weathered cheek. He looked down at the table, completely exhausted. "You actually had the courage to blow it all up." He took a deep, shuddering breath and looked back up, his eyes hardening into flint. "I want you all out of my house, tonight." "Richard, no." Victoria wailed, falling to her knees right there on the Persian rug, clutching at her designer dress. "I have nowhere to go." "The debts are your problem now, Victoria," Richard said coldly, not even looking down at her. He turned his eyes to Bradley. "You were a son to me. You are nothing to me now. Leave your keys, leave your credit cards, and never contact my family again." Bradley didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just gave a slow, agonizing nod, the ultimate price of his betrayal fully realized. I didn't wait to be told twice. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely manage it, but I reached up and unclasped the heavy diamond necklace, letting it drop onto my porcelain plate with a sickening clack. Then I grabbed the 10-carat ring, the symbol of my gilded cage, and slid it off my finger. I placed it perfectly center next to his untouched champagne glass. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't go to the guest wing to grab my coat. I just walked out of the dining room, down the marble hallway, and out the heavy oak front doors into the freezing, pouring rain, leaving my mother screaming hysterically on the floor behind me. I walked down the long, winding driveway in my soaked silk gown, the gravel tearing at my bare feet, the cold biting into my bones. I had absolutely nothing. No money, no security, no home. The massive iron service gates loomed in the darkness ahead. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps in the wet gravel behind me. I turned around. Bradley was walking toward me through the deluge. He had left his jacket, his bags, his entire inheritance behind. He was soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, shivering in the freezing wind. He stopped a few feet away from me, the heavy wrought iron gates standing between us and the terrifying reality of the rest of the world. We looked at each other, really looked at each other, stripped of the millions, the lies, the secrets, and the guilt. There was no fairy tale music playing. There was no triumphant victory. We had broken a family, shattered a young girl's heart, and ruined our own futures. It was messy, it was ugly, and the road ahead of us was going to be brutally unforgiving. But as he reached out and his calloused, freezing fingers intertwined with mine, a sudden blinding warmth flooded my chest. He pulled me into his arms, burying his face in my wet hair, holding on to me like I was the only solid thing left in a burning universe. I closed my eyes, leaning into the harsh, freezing rain, and took my first genuinely deep breath in over a year. I was completely ruined. I was entirely penniless. And for the very first time in my life, I was utterly, unapologetically free.